September 19th, 1944, 07:45 hours, Hill 265 near Ericourt in Lorraine. A heavy fog still covered the French countryside as tanks of the German 113th Panzer Brigade moved into position. They were preparing what should have been a perfect ambush. 12 Panther tanks, each armed with the powerful 75 mm KWK-42 gun, sat ready, watching 5 American Sherman tanks moving across the open ground below. The Americans looked completely unaware of the danger waiting for them. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. The Panther's 75 mm long gun could knock out a Sherman at $2,000 in. Its front armor, 80 mm thick and angled at 55 degrees, gave it an effective protection of about 140 mm, far too strong for a Sherman's 75 mm gun, except at point-blank range. Meanwhile, the Sherman's own frontal armor was only 50 mm thick. At nearly any distance, the Panther could pierce it with ease. By every technical measure, the battle looked one-sided. Yet within just 4 hours, the scene had completely reversed. 8 of those 12 Panthers were burning wrecks. The 5 Shermans of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion rolled forward untouched. By the end of that day, September 19th, the fields around Ericourt were scattered with 49 destroyed German tanks. American losses were minimal. Over the next 10 days, stretching to September 29th, the U.S. 4th Armored Division destroyed or damaged about 200 German armored vehicles, while losing only 48 of their own. The ratio defied every principle of tank design the Germans believed in. What happened at Ericourt was not simply a battlefield setback. It shattered the idea that superior German engineering could overcome American inferior tanks built in mass numbers. The Germans learned they had not been fighting tanks alone, but an entire system of coordinated weapons and tactics that redefined armored warfare. The counteroffensive itself came from Hitler's anger over the American breakout from Normandy. In early September 1944, as Patton's Third Army raced across France, Hitler ordered an immediate counterattack to crush the American spearhead and restore German prestige. The newly formed 113th Panzer Brigade, alongside the 111th Panzer Brigade and parts of the 11th Panzer Division, were sent against Patton's extended flank in Lorraine. The 113th Panzer Brigade fielded 45 Panthers and 45 Panzerführers under Oberst Hans-Hinrich Freiherr von Seckendorf. The 111th Panzer Brigade, commanded by General Major Heinrich Günther von Brüning, brought a similar strength. These formations represented Germany's last armored reserve in the West. They had been rushed together, their crews short on training due to fuel shortages, but they carried tanks that, on paper, outclassed anything the Americans had. The Panther reflected German design priorities perfectly. Its 75 mm KWK-42 L70 gun fired armor-piercing rounds at over 1,000 mass. At standard combat distances, it could punch through 140 mm of armor at $1,000, enough to destroy any Allied tank head-on. By comparison, the Sherman's M3 75 mm gun could penetrate only 88 mm at 500 mm and needed to close within about 100 mm to have any chance against a Panther's frontal armor. German doctrine focused on long-range tank duels, where accuracy and penetration decided victory. At training schools, Panther crews spent months studying firing tables, practicing ambush drills, and perfecting gunnery from distance. The Panther was considered the ultimate expression of that philosophy. What the Germans did not understand was that the Americans had built their own system around an entirely different concept. At Fort Knox, Colonel Bruce C. Clark had helped shape U.S. armored doctrine. American training emphasized speed, teamwork, and combined arms instead of raw tank specifications. U.S. doctrine taught that tanks rarely fought in isolation. Instead, they worked with infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, and aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, was a prime example of this doctrine in action. A West Point graduate from 1936, originally from the cavalry before moving into armor, Abrams saw tank combat not as duels between machines but as maneuver warfare. He focused on speed, aggression, and cooperation over armor thickness. His unit trained constantly in combined arms methods, firing on the move, and rapid target engagement. The 4th Armored Division had developed specific tactics against Panthers. They knew their own guns couldn't reliably pierce Panther armor from the front, so they drilled flanking moves, smoke screens, and coordination with artillery to disable or distract Panthers while Shermans moved into position for side shots. The Shermans' lighter weight and excellent reliability, often dismissed as weaknesses, became advantages that allowed faster maneuvers and sustained operations. On September 18, 1944, the German counteroffensive began. The 113th Panzer Brigade advanced toward Ericourt, expecting to roll over thin American defenses. German scouts reported little more than scattered infantry, tank destroyers, and maybe a company of Shermans. But American intelligence was far better than they realized. Ultra-code breaking had already revealed the German movements. Artillery spotter planes tracked German units in real time. The Americans knew where the Germans were headed, while the Germans advanced almost blind. At 800 on September 19th, 15th of Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade pushed forward in textbook formation near Rechicourt. They never expected what followed. For half an hour, American observers had been watching their approach. As the tanks crossed carefully pre-registered grid points, 12 U.S. artillery battalions, 144 guns, opened fire at once. The Americans used time-on-target barrages, where shells from multiple batteries fired from different ranges arrived simultaneously. 3 Panthers were destroyed in the opening minute, not by tanks but by artillery alone. The survivors pressed forward, shaken by the precision and weight of the bombardment. The Germans still managed to occupy Hill 265, setting up to ambush Abrams Shermans at about 1,200 nars, the perfect range for the Panther's gun. They fired the first shot. It missed. Before they could reload, all 5 Shermans fired back, not at the Panthers but at the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust and smoke. Then they split into separate directions. At the same moment, American forward observers directed fresh artillery onto the Panthers' positions. White phosphorus shells exploded, blinding optics with searing smoke. High explosive rounds smashed tracks and damaged vision blocks. Designed for precise long-range shooting, the Panthers were now blind and under relentless fire. Then the Shermans reappeared, not from the front but from 3 angles at once, using terrain the Germans had failed to reconnoiter. At ranges under 500 meter, their guns could finally punch through the Panthers' 40mm side armor. In close combat, the Shermans showed a key edge. Their hydraulic turret system could swing 360 degrees in 15 seconds. The Panthers' manual system took about 60 seconds, 4 times slower. At that range, the difference was fatal. American tank crews were trained to reload and fire in less than 4 seconds. That speed meant they could fire multiple rounds before German crews had even lined up their first shot. One of the best documented examples came when Captain William A. Dwight's Sherman platoon clashed with German Panthers near Leasy. The official after-action report records that Dwight's gunner, Sergeant Donald Decker, destroyed 4 Panthers in quick succession at ranges under 800 millars. Decker's own testimony, preserved in military archives, gives a clear picture of how it happened. We came around the corner of a small wood, and there were 3 Panthers in the open about 600 yards away. They were turning their turrets toward us, but we got the first shots off. I put 3 armor-piercing rounds into the side of the first before he could even fire. The second Panther I hit in the rear as it tried to back up. The third managed to fire once but missed high. We knocked it out immediately after. This fight highlighted the American edge and quick reaction. German gunnery followed a step-by-step process. The commander spotted the target, estimated the range, passed instructions, the gunner adjusted his sight, and the loader chose the right shell. American crews, by contrast, acted almost on instinct, drilled through thousands of live-fire exercises. They gave up long-range precision for speed in close combat, and at the ranges common at Ericourt, 500 to 800 Maldimer, speed meant survival. On September 20th, the Germans tried to seize the initiative. Elements of both the 113th and 111th Panzer Brigades attacked. Oberst von Zeckendorf himself led 40 Panthers forward with infantry support. At first, the operation looked promising. Mist covered the ground, and some American outposts were caught by surprise. But once contact was made, the U.S. response revealed its strength. Within minutes, American radios linked every Sherman to battalion and division headquarters. All units in the sector knew the German positions instantly. Forward artillery observers traveling with tank units called down suppressive fire right away. Then the weather began to clear, opening the sky to the 19th Tactical Air Command. Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, flying an L-4 Grasshopper observation plane modified with 6 bazookas, even attacked tanks directly. In an interview with Stars and Stripes on September 25, 1944, he explained, "Word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Today they saw me coming and started dodging. It's kind of hard to hit a tank going 60 mph across a field. The Americans fought as a system. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft overlapped their fields of fire. Panthers that halted to shoot at Shermans were blasted by artillery. Those that kept moving were hunted by fighter bombers. Any that tried to hide were caught by fast-moving tank destroyers." By September 21st, German command suffered a crushing blow. Oberst von Zeckendorf, leading from the front in traditional German fashion, was killed when artillery destroyed his command Panther. The brigade collapsed in confusion. German officers had been conditioned to follow strict orders rather than improvise. Without their leader, they froze. The very next day, September 22nd, General Major von Brüning of the 111th Panzer Brigade was also killed in action. In 48 hours, both brigade commanders were gone, paralyzing German command and control. The U.S. Army worked differently. American doctrine demanded flexibility. If a commander went down, his subordinates immediately assumed control and kept the plan moving. Captain James Leach, commanding Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion, showed this on September 22nd at Juvilliers. When his own radio was destroyed by a near miss, his platoon leaders carried on independently. In that battle, 7 of Leach's Shermans destroyed 17 German tanks while losing only 1. The action earned Leach the Distinguished Service Cross. As skies cleared between September 21st and 23rd, American air superiority came down in full force. The 19th Tactical Air Command, under Major General Elwood Pete Quesada, had perfected close air support in a way Germany could not match. P-47 Thunderbolts armed with bombs and rockets flew in continuous waves. Coordination between ground and air was seamless. Forward air controllers rode inside Shermans, using the same maps and grid references as tank crews. When tanks faced resistance, controllers could bring in fighter bombers within minutes. The P-47 pilots could distinguish friend from foe even at speed. American units marked themselves with colored panels and smoke signals. German reports captured later described the sheer terror of constant air attack. The Panther's 16mm roof armor, strong enough against shrapnel, was useless against direct hits from 500 lb bombs or 5-inch rockets. Even near misses damaged optics, jammed turrets, or concussed the crew. The psychological strain was often worse than the physical destruction. German crews became unable to fight in daylight without risking annihilation. Soon movement was restricted to nights or poor weather. September 25th at Juvilliers showed American tactics at their peak. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Captain Spencer, faced around 30 German tanks advancing in open ground. Spencer had just 7 working Shermans. Instead of charging head-on, he executed a textbook ambush. His tanks dug into hull-down positions behind a ridge, exposing only their turrets. As the Germans moved forward, Spencer's gunners opened fire not to wipe them out immediately, but to break up their formation. At the same time, he called for smoke shells from artillery cloaking the field. While the Panthers groped through the haze, 3 Shermans slipped through a hidden valley the Germans had failed to scout. At point-blank range, they opened fire from the flank, destroying 8 Panthers in just 3 minutes. The German column, blinded and attacked from 2 sides, fell apart. In the end, 17 tanks were destroyed, 8 damaged. U.S. losses, 1 Sherman damaged, quickly repaired. By September 24th, the weaknesses in German armored doctrine were plain. The Panther, though formidable on paper, was plagued by mechanical failures in battle. U.S. Army studies after the war, including research from the Ballistic Research Laboratory, showed that in 30 documented engagements the Sherman achieved a kill ratio of 3:6 over the Panther. This wasn't due to superior guns or armor, but because Shermans were available and kept running. The Panther's drivetrain was overstressed by its 45-ton weight. Its transmission had been designed for lighter tanks and broke often. Its overlapping road wheel system, which spread weight well on solid ground, clogged with mud in Lorraine's wet terrain. Technical brilliance collapsed under real-world conditions. When the ground froze overnight, tanks could become stuck and unable to move. The Sherman, however, proved far more reliable because of its simple design. A Sherman could travel hundreds of miles before it needed major repairs. Its tracks could be tightened in just minutes. Engines swapped out in 4 hours and transmissions built with extra strength for the tank's 33-ton weight rarely broke down. Even when parts failed, American crews had no trouble replacing them, thanks to standardized components and steady supplies. U.S. maintenance teams carried out repairs that the Germans considered nearly impossible. The 37th Tank Battalion's maintenance platoon, run by skilled NCOs trained at Fort Knox, kept about 90% of their Shermans in working condition through the battle. By comparison, German tank units often struggled to keep even 50% of their armor running. By September 26th, more German Panthers were out of action due to breakdowns than from being destroyed in combat. The fight at Ericourt ultimately came down to logistics. Both armies were running low on fuel as their supply lines stretched across France, but the Americans and Germans handled the crisis very differently. Patton's Third Army had to operate under strict rationing. Armored divisions were given 25,000 gallons of fuel daily, even though 75,000 gallons were considered the minimum for full operations. This shortage pushed American ingenuity into overdrive. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, hauled 12,000 tons of supplies every day over routes that stretched more than 300 miles. When official deliveries didn't meet demands, Patton quietly allowed units to borrow fuel from other commands. The Germans, on the other hand, faced disaster. Their new panzer brigades had been promised fuel and ammunition, but supplies never matched the promises. A Panther burned through 5 gallons of fuel per mile when traveling cross-country. A full 200-gallon tank meant only about 80 miles of range. With their supply lines constantly under air attack and Germany's fuel production crippled by bombing, tanks often sat motionless, waiting for fuel that never arrived. Ammunition shortages added to their problems. Shermans carried a mix of high explosive, armor-piercing, and white phosphorus rounds, letting them fight tanks, infantry, and fortifications alike. U.S. artillery depots in Normandy sent a steady flow of shells forward. German Panthers, mostly stocked with armor-piercing rounds, could do little against infantry or soft targets. When their ammunition ran out, German crews had no way to resupply under fire. The most devastating difference came from artillery. On September 26th, when German forces launched a major attack, American gunners responded with overwhelming firepower. The 4th Armored Division's artillery, reinforced with corps-level assets, was able to mass over 150 guns on a single target within minutes. This was made possible by a revolutionary system. Forward observers equipped with radios and accurate maps sent grid coordinates directly to fire direction centers. Using pre-calculated firing data and mechanical computers, those centers converted requests into commands in seconds. Multiple batteries could fire together, and with time-on-target calculations, shells from different guns arrived at the same instant. German troops used to the Eastern Front, where artillery was scarce and poorly coordinated, were stunned by the volume and accuracy. Any time they tried to assemble, they were bracketed with fire. If they moved in daylight, they were bombarded. On September 26th alone, U.S. artillery fired more than 15,000 rounds to support the 4th Armored Division. German guns, with only a handful of tubes and limited shells, could respond with just scattered fire, quickly silenced by American sound-ranging equipment. The battle also highlighted the value of U.S. tank destroyer doctrine. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, armed with M18 Hellcats, followed the Seek, Strike, and Destroy approach developed at Camp Hood, Texas. The M18 was the complete opposite of the Panther. Instead of armor, it relied on speed and agility. Capable of 55 MP, the fastest tracked vehicle of World War II, it mounted a powerful 76-millimeter gun that let it hit hard and then disappear before the enemy could respond. On September 27th, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper and his platoon pulled off a textbook ambush. Concealed in a tree line, they let a column of German tanks roll past before firing into their weaker rear armor. In just 12 minutes, they destroyed 5 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs, then relocated before the enemy could fire back. Not a single Hellcat was lost. The impact of the M18 went beyond kills. Its speed forced German tanks to constantly guard their flanks, slowing their operations and disrupting formations. By the end of the battle, the 704th Battalion had claimed 39 confirmed tank kills, while losing only 4 M18s. The climax came on September 29th, when General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most respected panzer commanders, personally led the final major assault. He had taken command 2 days earlier to rally the battered brigades, bringing tactical expertise and experience. His attack began at 600 hours with about 30 surviving Panthers, supported by infantry from the 11th Panzer Division. The Germans fought with skill, making good use of terrain and coordinating tanks and infantry effectively. But the Americans were ready. Colonel Bruce Clark, leading Combat Command A, had advance warning thanks to intercepted communications. He positioned his forces in prepared defenses and pre-registered artillery. As the Germans advanced, they walked into a trap. U.S. artillery cut their infantry away from their tanks. Tank destroyers struck from the flanks while Shermans held firm in the center. When the morning fog cleared, P-47 Thunderbolts swooped in, adding devastating air power. By midday, Manteuffel's assault collapsed. 22 German tanks were destroyed or abandoned, and the rest withdrew toward Germany. When the Battle of Ericourt ended on September 29, 1944, the results were decisive. Out of an initial 262 tanks and assault guns, the Germans had only 62 left in running condition, a loss of 76%. The 113th Panzer Brigade was wiped out as a combat force, and the 111th Panzer Brigade suffered the same fate. Even the veteran 11th Panzer Division was reduced to the strength of a single regiment. American losses, though significant, were far lighter by comparison. The 4th Armored Division lost 48 tanks during September 1944. Out of these, 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers were lost specifically in the battles around Ericourt. Most of the damaged Shermans were quickly repaired and returned to service. American crews also suffered fewer losses compared to their German counterparts, thanks to the Sherman's safer design. Its escape hatches and better internal layout gave crews more chances to get out alive when hit. The kill ratio during these battles was roughly 6 to 1 in favor of the Americans, something German military doctrine said should never have happened. The Panther, with its thicker armor and more powerful gun, was supposed to dominate the Sherman. Yet at Ericourt the opposite occurred. The victory wasn't about Sherman versus Panther duels. It came from combined arms tactics, greater flexibility, stronger logistics, and overwhelming artillery and air support. The U.S. Army's after-action analysis of Ericourt shaped doctrine for decades to come. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox collected detailed reports from every unit that fought, building one of the most complete studies of modern armored warfare. Several lessons stood out. First, technical specifications didn't decide battles. The Panthers' better armor and firepower meant little when Americans refused to fight on German terms. They used artillery barrages, airstrikes, and flanking maneuvers to cancel out German advantages. Second, reliability mattered more than raw performance. A Sherman that could fight every day was far more useful than a Panther that sat broken half the time. Consistent operational availability multiplied American strength. Third, training and flexibility outweighed individual acts of heroism. U.S. crews, all products of standardized Fort Knox training, could rotate roles inside the tank, work seamlessly with artillery and infantry, and adjust quickly without needing constant orders. German crews, rushed through shortened training, couldn't match this level of competence. Fourth, logistics shaped what was possible. The U.S. supply chain delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across a 400-mile line, ensuring continuous operations. German forces, short on supplies, saw their options narrow until many tanks were left stranded and helpless. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose leadership of the 37th Tank Battalion proved vital, explained it clearly in his report. Victory didn't come from one factor, but from the disciplined use of combined arms. His battalion showed that aggressive action, backed by artillery and air power, could beat even technically superior tanks. Abrams later rose to Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, and his lessons at Ericourt influenced doctrine throughout the Cold War. The M1 Abrams tank, named after him, carried forward the same priorities: reliability, crew survival, and integrated systems over raw specifications. On the German side, General Hasso von Manteuffel gave a blunt assessment after the war. In interrogations, he admitted that Ericourt exposed the failure of German doctrine. The Wehrmacht's focus on superior machines and individual skill could not stand against America's systematic approach. The U.S. had turned warfare into a coordinated process, where organization, logistics, and planning outweighed technical edges. Intelligence also played a decisive role. Ultra-code breaking provided advance warning of German movements, while reconnaissance from armored cavalry and light aircraft kept commanders updated in real time. Colonel Oskar Koch, intelligence chief for Third Army, developed new ways to merge information. His staff compared ultra-intercepts with aerial photos, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations to build full enemy assessments. This often meant U.S. commanders knew what the Germans were about to do, before German officers even passed orders to their own men. With this advantage, the Americans could position reserves, exploit fuel shortages, and press attacks when German tanks broke down. Behind the lines, maintenance was just as important. The 126th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, supporting the 4th Armored Division, worked almost like an assembly line. They repaired tanks under fire, keeping vehicles in action at rates the Germans could never match. Master Sergeant John Fulner explained in a 1945 Yank magazine interview, track repairs in 1 hour, engine swaps in 4 hours, transmission changes in 6 hours. Spare parts were pre-stocked at all levels, ensuring broken Shermans returned to combat within days. A Sherman knocked out on Monday might be back in service by Wednesday. German Panthers needing rare parts and special tools could remain disabled for weeks if they weren't abandoned under American fire. Medical support further tipped the balance. The 4th Armored Division's medical battalion could move a wounded soldier from the battlefield to surgery within the golden hour, vastly improving survival rates. Tank crew injuries, burns, amputations, blast wounds required immediate treatment, and American doctrine emphasized forward surgical hospitals staffed with specialists. Plasma, morphine, and sulfa drugs were available right at company level. Even experimental helicopter evacuation saved tankers who otherwise wouldn't have survived. This gave U.S. crews psychological confidence. They fought harder knowing wounds weren't a death sentence. German crews, lacking comparable support, fought more cautiously. Weather also shaped events. Morning fog between September 18th and 21st at first seemed to help the Germans by concealing their movements and limiting U.S. artillery observation. But fog also removed the Panthers' long-range advantage, forcing close engagements where Shermans held their own. When the skies cleared from September 21st to 23rd, American advantages returned. Clear weather meant strong air support, artillery spotting at full range, and firmer ground that favored the lighter Shermans. Panthers, with heavier weight and greater ground pressure, continued to bog down. The Battle of Ericourt highlighted a simple truth. Wars aren't won by the best tank on paper. They're won through organization, adaptability, logistics, training, and support systems that keep soldiers fighting day after day. Rain fell again between September 24th and 26th, turning the battlefield into mud that hit German forces especially hard. The Panther tank, with its interleaved road wheels meant to spread out weight, became a liability. Mud packed into the wheels, then froze solid overnight, locking the tracks in place. Several Panthers were knocked out of action not by American firepower but by frozen mud. Shermans, with their simpler track systems, were much easier to free, either through raw engine power or quick field maintenance. American communications provided another decisive edge. The 4th Armored Division ran multiple radio networks at the same time. Command channels, fire support, logistics, and even air support. Every Sherman carried 2 radios. The SCR-528 gave clear voice contact over more than 10 miles, while the SCR-506 connected directly with supporting units. These FM radios resisted interference and enemy interception, letting American forces coordinate securely and flexibly. German tanks, by contrast, relied on fewer radios with weaker ranges. Most Panthers carried the Fu-5 set, which had an effective reach of only 2 miles. When German command tanks were destroyed, top targets for American gunners, entire units were cut off from communication. This breakdown accelerated German defeat. Ericourt also highlighted the results of America's massive training program. At Fort Knox, the Armored Force School built the world's most complete tank training system. Every U.S. crewman who fought at Ericourt had gone through 17 weeks of basic and advanced training, 13 weeks of crew drills, 8 weeks of combined arms exercises, and full live fire with full ammo loads. Crews were trained in maintenance for every part of the tank. This ensured consistency. Any crew member could step into any role and any crew could mesh smoothly with another. Even if men were lost, the team kept fighting at full strength. German training by 1944 was collapsing. Fuel shortages left little time for practice driving. Ammunition shortages cut gunnery training. The Panthers' complexity demanded long, careful training, but most new units were rushed to the front with barely 100 hours of real tank time. American crews, by comparison, averaged more than 1,000 hours. The battle cannot be separated from the larger picture of September 1944. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. In the east, Soviet armies had destroyed Army Group Center and were approaching Germany itself. In the west, France and Belgium had been liberated. German industry was crippled by bombing, while Romania's defection had cut off vital oil supplies. The Aricourt counterattack was one of Germany's last serious efforts to regain the initiative. Its failure proved that Germany could no longer launch major offensives. The loss of precious Panthers and their experienced crews, who could not be replaced, sped up the German collapse. For the United States, Aricourt validated its entire war approach. Mass production, structured training, technology, and tactical flexibility worked together to defeat German doctrine and tank design. It showed that the American system could beat any opponent anywhere, a lesson that shaped U.S. doctrine for decades. Behind the battlefield success was America's industrial machine. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, also known as the Fisher Tank Arsenal, was a symbol of this power. Built in just 6 months, by 1944 it could turn out 1,000 tanks per month. The focus was on standardization and reliability. Every Sherman had interchangeable engines, transmissions, and parts. Maintenance crews knew any replacement part would fit. German production, by contrast, was weighed down by constant design changes. Panthers built at different times often had parts that didn't match. Their drive for technical perfection created supply chaos, worsened as Allied bombing wrecked factories. By September 1944, the U.S. was producing 2,000 Shermans per month, while Germany built fewer than 400 Panthers. This 5:1 production ratio, paired with better reliability, gave the Americans overwhelming local superiority, often 3-1 or more, even when Germans tried to concentrate their forces. Yet tank battles were not clean contests of machines. They were brutal, terrifying experiences. A Sherman hit by a Panther's shell could erupt into fire as ammunition cooked off, earning it the grim nickname Ronson, after the lighter that lit every time. German crews faced horrors of their own. White phosphorus shells filled their tanks with choking smoke, forcing them to choose between suffocating inside or fleeing under fire. Commanders, who often stood with hatches open for visibility, were easy targets for artillery airbursts, with shrapnel tearing through turrets. Wounds were severe. Burns from flames or phosphorus, traumatic amputations from shell fragments, brain injuries from concussions. Medical care of the time struggled to treat such injuries. Still, amid the carnage, moments of humanity appeared. American medics treated German prisoners alongside their own. Tankers risked themselves to pull enemies from burning wrecks. French civilians, scarred by occupation, still cared for the wounded on both sides. The battle also produced large numbers of German prisoners. Under Geneva Convention rules, interrogations revealed just how bad the German situation had become. Captured crews admitted they were short on fuel, had minimal training, and faced tanks already breaking down before battle. Their accounts confirmed what the battlefield had already shown. Germany no longer had the means to match American strength. German prisoners at Aricourt were most struck by the overwhelming scale of American firepower. They spoke of the endless artillery, the constant presence of aircraft overhead, and the vast supply of ammunition that never seemed to run dry. What surprised them even more was their treatment after capture. Unlike the brutal conditions many had seen on the Eastern Front, American forces followed strict rules. Prisoners were given medical care, proper food, and protection from violence. This humane conduct directly contradicted Nazi propaganda that had painted Americans as savages. Often, the fair treatment made captured soldiers more willing to talk. Their testimony gave U.S. commanders valuable intelligence. From these interrogations, Americans learned about Germany's desperate fuel shortages, which helped them plan attacks when tanks could no longer maneuver. They discovered details about mechanical troubles which encouraged relentless pursuit before repairs could be made. Information about the loss of German officers revealed gaps in leadership that the Americans quickly exploited. The cost of the battle was also felt deeply in the French countryside. Aricourt, a small town in Lorraine, became the center of fierce fighting. Civilians, who had already endured 4 years of German rule, now found themselves trapped between two armies. The town mayor later described the battle's chaos to American reporters. Deafening explosions, constant shell fire, tanks roaring through the streets, aircraft circling overhead. Homes were destroyed, but to the locals the devastation meant liberation was near. When they saw the burned-out German tanks, they knew the Americans had prevailed. Civilian losses were heavy, though exact numbers remain uncertain, as shells and tank fire struck both military and civilian targets without distinction. Ericourt itself changed hands several times, each shift bringing further destruction. Yet after the war, most locals expressed gratitude, seeing freedom as worth the terrible cost. French resistance fighters also played a major role. They tracked German troop movements, pointed out supply depots, and guided American units across terrain they knew intimately. This underground intelligence, built over years of occupation, gave the Americans a sharper edge than any map could provide. The battle's impact reached far beyond Lorraine. It became a standard case study at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. Officers examined how the 4th Armored Division combined tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single coordinated effort. The lessons shaped American military thinking for decades. They also influenced tank design. While the Soviets and Germans kept pushing for bigger, heavier tanks, the U.S. focused on reliability, standard parts, and integration with other systems. This philosophy carried into the M26 Pershing, and later the M48 Patton. During the Cold War, NATO adopted Ericourt's principles, using artillery, airstrikes, and maneuver to counter the numerically larger Soviet forces. Modern historians view Ericourt as a turning point in armored warfare. It marked the shift from industrial-age combat based on sheer production to information-age combat, where coordination and communication multiplied combat power. The U.S. had shown that linking multiple weapons in real time could overwhelm even technically superior tanks. German military studies in the 1950s were blunt in their assessment. Ericourt was a failure at every level. Strategically, Germany had wasted its last reserves on a secondary front while the Soviets crushed them in the east. Operationally, new panzer brigades had been rushed into battle without training or support. Tactically, the rigid doctrine of long-range tank duels failed against flexible combined arms warfare. Interviews with German veterans in the 1960s and 1970s reinforced these conclusions. Many admitted their shock at American effectiveness. They had expected an army that relied on numbers and supplies but lacked tactical skill. Instead, they faced a force that excelled in tactics, logistics, technology, and leadership. Over time, the battle even took on a legendary aura. Stories of small numbers of Shermans defeating large groups of Panthers became popular. While some of those tales were based on real encounters, the larger truth was that U.S. victory came not from isolated acts of bravery, but from systematic superiority. The Sherman tank itself, often mocked in later history, proved its worth at Ericourt. The Panther may have had thicker armor and a stronger gun, but it fought as a tank alone. The Sherman succeeded because it was part of a larger system, supported by artillery, infantry, aircraft, and constant resupply. This proved that wars are not won by single weapons, no matter how advanced, but by the integration of every element: training, doctrine, logistics, technology, and leadership working together. Ericourt, fought from September 18 to 29, 1944, was more than just a local battle. It was the proof that America's military philosophy, built in the years between the world wars, worked in practice. German crews arrived confident in their traditions, their tactics, and their Panthers. They believed superior machines and skill would triumph. Instead, they found themselves crushed by a new kind of warfare, one that treated tanks as just one piece of a larger machine. The Americans used artillery, air power, intelligence, logistics, and communications together in a way the Germans could not match. The survivors carried this painful realization back to Germany. They knew now that courage and powerful tanks alone were not enough. The Americans had built a system that multiplied every advantage, turning material power into battlefield dominance. The 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Abrams embodied this truth. Those 5 Shermans that faced down German Panthers were not alone. They carried with them the full weight of American industry, training, and doctrine, the power of a nation committed to total war. Within 8 months, that same system would bring Nazi Germany to unconditional surrender. The burned wrecks scattered across the fields of Ericourt told the story. Technical superiority had been defeated by systematic superiority. The German tankers who walked away alive had seen the future of warfare, and it belonged to the Americans.